Ugly Betty. It's no secret that the show is one of my favorite shows of all time. And yet, every time I watch it, I either go angry or nostalgic. So let's talk about it. Betty deserved better. That's what this video is going to be about. Just so you know. Hey guys, it's your Deborah, studio singer-songwriter and everything else in between. And normally I'm on camera, but I got sick and I also lost my voice. So that will not be happening. I also recorded this video over a series of days, even though I was sick. So if you hear my voice break at different times or change an octave, I am so sorry. Anyways, let's get into it.
Let's start with episodes 1 to 10. And this time, Betty starts a job at Mode magazine, which is an extension of Meade Publications. She is geeky and awkward, and the only reason that she's actually seriously chosen is because of the owner of Meade Publications actually thinks that she was so unattractive, his own son wouldn't be distracted by her as they were working together. Yikes. We see Betty come in as this timid, shy, and naive girl into Mode magazine. She's quickly thrown into this world of ultra competition, fat phobia, diet culture, and just a bunch of toxicity around her. She's bullied by her colleagues and by her boss and by basically everyone around her, including her own family. And unfortunately, during the early seasons, she is very much a people pleaser. Now, in the show, there are multiple storylines that happen at the same time, but right now we're focused on Betty. Now, I could spend time recapping everything that happens in the episodes, but that would literally make this a 2-hour video. But basically, what you need to know is that in every season, in each episode, there is always a dilemma at Mode. It's either Wilhelmina trying to sabotage it because she's working with another villain in the story, or trying to make sure the power is in her hands and she ends up editor, or she's scheming something else to try and own Mode magazine, or it's Daniel Meade having to prove himself in each episode because he's still kind of a party boy and then also a very big man child who used to sleep with lots of women, and now he's trying to prove himself at Mode against Wilhelmina because she hates him and she believes that she should be the editor and not Daniel. Because let's face it, Daniel Meade is not only a man child, but he's also a nepo baby, which is actually a valid point. Also, comment down below if you want me to make a video on Wilhelmina, because I think she's such an interesting, fun villain. While dealing with all of this, Betty has to work for Daniel as his assistant, and throughout each and every episode, she ends up having to do tasks which are way above her pay grade. She constantly goes above and beyond, saving Daniel's ass and partly kind of being his surrogate mother, which I'll discuss later, as if that's part of the job description, all while barely earning minimum wage. She goes through each obstacle, and majority of the times it ends out working out for her, and with each obstacle she learns more and more and becomes more resilient and experiences more character growth. She's also friends with Christina. There's nothing important there, but I just love Christina. She's an absolute icon. Anyways, while she goes through all of this, she also goes through extreme bullying by her colleagues, including Marc and Amanda. Marc is, in my humble opinion, Wilhelmina's personal slave, therapist, confidant, errand boy, and assistant. And Amanda is the receptionist who has no direction in life but to be available for Daniel the playboy and has some eventual character growth, but it surely does take a while with Amanda. I do think she is very funny comedic relief. Oh, and of course, she's a horrible receptionist. In between all of this that's happening in her work life, Betty also has to deal with her family, the pressures of being a second-generation immigrant child, and its interwoven complicated dynamics. On the one hand, she grew up in this home which her father instilled these values of strong morals and not lying, not cheating, and not doing things that are immoral. But at the same time, she goes to work and she's literally thrown into the fashion world where everything she's taught is the complete opposite, which can honestly make you feel like you're living a double life, aka the Betty effect. But I will talk about that later. Betty in the first season has a cheating wimp of a boyfriend who, I would like to reiterate, cheats on her, named Walter. She breaks it off with him, but he creeps his way back into her life by somewhat stalking her and going back to her family to beg for forgiveness, in which her family advises her to take him back, which is absolute garbage. Just garbage. But by the end of the season, things do get better for Betty. She meets my favorite boyfriend of them all, Henry Grubstick. I will always stand up for Henry. I love Henry, and no one else can tell me different. The main villain, aside from Wilhelmina, is found out to be Daniel's brother, now turned sister, because she is a trans woman who was thought to be dead but actually went through surgery and is now actually a trans woman called Alexis, which, I mean, considering the time that this show was released, was absolutely like the wildest plot twist. I was not expecting it. Anyways, that's basically the gist of season 1. In season 2, things get significantly better for Betty. The similar layout of all these events keep on following again, but this time there's some differences. There's some differences concerning her father's immigration problems and the fact that he is deported to Mexico, and she basically has to take a decision that goes against her morals in order to get her father a citizenship, which was a very, very altering moment for Betty because she's always been used to doing what's morally correct. Betty now realizes that the world is not so easily black and white, and that she is capable of making dubious decisions and being a complex human being. Another change that happens this season is that Betty meets Gio. Gio is the complete opposite of all the other love interests that she's had on the show. He's a snack canteen operator. He's brash, somewhat rude, and certainly not my favorite choice as a love interest, but he pushes Betty to be more than assistant in mode and quote unquote a mode girl. As much as I don't really like him, his conflicting energy becomes a spark which revives Betty's ambition, which I absolutely adore. He encourages to apply for the writers program and not just being an assistant at mode. Gio is clearly into Betty, and Betty is also clearly into Gio, even though she's in denial about it. They never fully have like a fully developed relationship, but I think he was just there as another sort of catalyst in Betty's story. At the end of the season, Henry comes back to propose to Betty after him and Betty have tried to work out the mess that is the relationship between themselves. We see Betty move out into her own New York apartment, which is crazy to think that she could afford it on a salary like that. I think that's highly unrealistic. But this is also the early 2000s, so you never know. With Betty moving out, she establishes her independence, and I'm absolutely here for it. It becomes noticeable that Betty in season 3 takes more of a stance in the season, and while romantically things were more of a mess, at the beginning at least, she suggests more ideas to her bosses, and even though they don't want to take them, the ideas still end up winning in the end. Case in point, in season 3, episode 2, when Penelope de Rio's cosmetics asks her if she wears the actual cosmetics, which are very overpriced. Betty here is honest, and it shows that she has less fear.
Did you choose my cosmetics? No. I can't afford them. Sorry.
In season 1, however, Betty was constantly just more nervous and was always worried about her job being on the line. But after the 2 seasons and establishing a stronger bond with Daniel and the Meades, she is a much more valuable asset. And while it's not expressed immediately, Betty becomes more sure of herself. She's seen the ways of mode and knows what to expect. In with the self-assured and out with the naive. She stands up to Marc more and also to Amanda. And even Marc cannot deny Betty's resilience and staying power. In my personal opinion, Marc has always been jealous of Betty. In this season, we also get to see Betty as Wilhelmina Slater, or a version thereof. And besides the horrid wig and the puppy kicking, which was absolutely terrible, I actually loved seeing Betty as Wilhelmina. It was actually super fun to see Betty in a position of power and not just being an assistant.
It's Daniel, remember? We used to work together?
No time.
No, Betty, I just wanted...
Security!
No, wait.
She even negotiates herself a damn raise. In this season, she applies to the prestigious Yeti program, which is called the Young Editors Training Initiative, and dates a wealthy, complicated, complex man called Matt Hartley, who ends up being an asshole to her when they break up, but I digress. Personally, him as a love interest, I don't know, like, he was the kind of filler boyfriend for me. Again, another stepping stone. His energy is very different from all the other guys she's dated, and I don't know, like, I didn't really feel anything for Matt. And then I think the writers clearly showed that when they just shipped him off to Africa in the last episode, not even mentioning where in Africa, as if Africa is a country, y'all. Child, the ghetto. Anyways, in this season, Betty still has feelings for Henry, and she unfortunately does cheat on Matt, which spawns him to be an asshole later, but I digress. Betty and Henry still have feelings for each other,
but that eventually ends up being a dead end, so that's not really important. In regards to Henry, I really hate how they did their relationship dirty. Henry is one of my favorite boyfriends, and the fact that they just never let Betty have like a stable relationship for a while was really upsetting to me. And the crazy storyline of him and Charlie getting together doesn't seem like something practical that Henry would do, but I guess we had to go with it because plot development. I was not liking how they did my man like that. but by the last time that they meet each other, they're in completely different places. Henry has a kid and Betty does not. Yeah, that's gonna put a huge strain on the relationship. But for me, Henry will always be my favorite. I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's the geekiness of it or the fact that the show really tried to convince me that Henry was just a geeky man, even though my man was low-key, high-key ripped and lean. But I digress. But anyway, let's get into another hot topic. Season 4. Boy, oh boy, y'all, I have opinions about this one. So the beginning half of the season starts off with the two halves of the episode called the butterfly effect, and immediately things are changing. It's first being alluded to that Betty's getting her braces off, which, by the way, I would just like to say again, Betty getting her braces off, yes, makes a difference, but does not necessarily take away the fact that the actress that plays Betty is still beautiful with braces on. Like, this show really tried to convince me that braces were her problem. There are still beautiful people out there in the world who have braces. It didn't really make much of a difference for me. However, later in the seasons, when she decides to change her outfits, now that's when the true transformation comes in. She first starts by wearing this pantsuit in the early episodes of the season. She goes to this blue, red, and yellow outfit, which are 3 primary colors, and they're all bold. Personally, it's not my favorite look out of all the looks that she's worn, but it's definitely a better step in the right direction. As the season progresses, Betty finally finds a style that fits her body type, and her look and her essence, which I really do adore. And she still has a lot of color in some of the outfits, so it doesn't take away from the core things that she loves. In season 4, she's editor at Mode, but towards the end of the season, she gets a job opportunity in London, which is great. I love that she was finally allowed to branch onto new things. I will say, I was unsatisfied with season 4's ending. Period. That's all I have to say about it. Now, I feel like this is just me, but I do not like the idea of Daniel and Betty being together because simply it feels rushed. Sorry, not sorry. The whole entire time of the show, Betty and Daniel's relationship has been more of that of friends and co-workers and a team rather than a romantic relationship. I can allude to many times that Daniel has just not seen Betty as quote unquote attractive, even though she's a beautiful woman. Now, I know Betty and Daniel have had a long history. She's seen him in his Playboy days, but let's not forget that in season 1, he actually sent Betty on an errand to find all the women that he'd slept with in New York to get his watch back, which, by the way, was actually being held by Amanda. I mean, in a lot of the episodes, Betty has practically been his surrogate mother. Without her, Daniel would have never survived Wilhelmina's schemes and Mode on his own without Betty's brain power. If it wasn't for Betty, he would have kept that bullshit magazine called Players. No offense, no shade, no tea, of course. Honestly, we need to put some respect on Betty's name for real. Betty has seen Daniel get married and lose his wife Molly to cancer. She helped him grieve, again dropping her life to go help Daniel Meade because he's the biggest man child. So in that sense, like, their dynamics have never been from that of enemies to lovers or from friends to lovers, but it's been enemies to assistant to friend to confidant, which is why it feels weird when they try and put them together. Betty and Daniel have no romantic or sexual chemistry. I'm sorry. Also, let's not forget that in season 1, Hilda kisses Daniel in a little weird moment, which I completely forgot it happened until I was looking for clips for this video. But like, it's insane how much Daniel has gotten around. And you mean to tell me that after everything that they've been through, that Betty would end up with Daniel? That doesn't make any sense. In my personal opinion, the writers should have kept them as close friends. And maybe because they work well together, they could have opened something of their own, whether it's their own magazine or business or something that Betty would do well in. Since she's not the biggest fashion girly, but both of them work together on an amazing team. Or perhaps Betty would have had her own magazine that Daniel would invest in, you know? Either way, in my personal opinion, Daniel and Betty do not belong together. Or at least they could have belonged together if the show did it right, but it didn't. As for the remainder of her love interests, Henry eventually was a no-go, as we've established. Matt's ending was also super weird to me. Like, why did they send this man to Africa? Bro, like, what? I mean, she did cheat on Matt, so I completely understand that was difficult, and they did reunite in season 4. But like, child, like, they just moved this man to a whole new continent without even explaining where he was gonna go. Gio. Now, Gio's not my favorite, but I definitely don't think it wouldn't have worked out since at the end of season 4, they were completely different places in their lives. Gio was also a little bit judgmental of Betty working at Mode, so I don't know how that would have continued. But I mean, he was definitely, like I said, a catalyst for Betty's story. But anyway, concerning season 4, they could have given Betty someone new or worked up something. Anything was better than Daniel and Betty being together. Like, I was so unsatisfied by that ending. But I digress.
Betty is also not perfect. She also somewhat has a righteous complex about herself, and of course judges everybody that she works with. This character flaw does continue throughout the whole entire show, unfortunately. She's always constantly having to do things the right and moral way. I've actually seen online a lot of people discuss about this and say that this made her character completely annoying and unbearable, which at some points I actually do agree. There's some decisions that Betty makes that I honestly think to myself, like, girl, you seriously, for real right now? Okay. However, you also have to see the fact that Betty is literally the product of the environment that she grew up in. She's been raised by a father that has seen rich people as most of the time immoral and dishonest, which leads her to have a very odd relationship with money. As a result, when she is thrown into the world full of people who make dubious decisions, she naturally judges them. Arguably, a lot of the rich characters that we do see in Ugly Betty are actually very much dubious people, okay? And they don't make good decisions at all, so I don't completely blame her, but sometimes her own self-righteousness can get in her way. She is, in fact, a complex character, which makes her all the more human. What could be a more human flaw than us judging one another? If she was completely perfect, we wouldn't want to support her anyway, but instead we grow with her. In season 1, we're greeted with the theme of Betty is expected to settle. Betty is never expected or encouraged to want more out of her life. At first, I wanted to understand why in the early seasons Betty let so much slide, and the bullying and the people pleasing, I really didn't get it. She was bullied and constantly gave no comeback, and she let a lot of people walk all over her and also let a lot of disrespect slide. And I wanted to understand why. But you can see the reason why in her familial upbringing. In her family, she's seen as the smart girl who would study and get a good job. But outside of that, she was not really encouraged to do more. You see this a lot in season 1 with her relationships, and especially with her sister, with her boyfriend Walter. Walter initially cheats on her with this person called Gina Combaro, who is the complete opposite of Betty when it comes to style and personality. And even though he cheats on her, the family literally encourages her to get back with him, which I've never heard of that before. I think that is actually gutter tier garbage. Her so-called sister Hilda actually encourages her to take Walter back even after he cheated on her, which really broke my heart. I mean, who needs enemies when you have family like this? You see this also in how Walter treats her. When Betty starts working at Mode, he is immediately threatened by this and micromanages her and becomes extremely possessive, even though he is the one who cheated on her. He expects Betty to only go so far. He also tries to ask her to move in with him when she's not ready, just trying to pressure her and trying to keep her under his control so he still feels good enough as a person. Walter is still somewhat liked by Betty's family, even her father, which absolutely is terrible. And they would often blame her if things went wrong in their relationship. Again, he cheated on her. Anyways, now you could argue that one of the reasons that Betty goes through this by her family is just because she's not seen as conventionally beautiful. And because of this, she's expected to just settle because they generally think that she cannot do better. As if they somewhat believe that there is no better man that can value Betty and her personality, who could love her, take care of her, and support her without cheating on her. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Let's talk about another theme that comes up in Ugly Betty: jealousy. It's no secret that Betty has quite a few adversaries on her way through Mode and her career. Since the beginning, Betty has been dragged by everyone left, right, and center. And it's no secret that Amanda and Marc and the rest of her Mode colleagues, except Christina, didn't think Betty was good enough to work at Mode because of how she looked. And even Betty's own sister, Hilda, shows jealousy towards Betty many a times throughout the show, even though she's deemed as the quote-unquote hotter sister. And many a times, Hilda actually sabotages Betty in many different forms. When Henry wanted to speak to Betty after Betty saw him being kissed by somebody else, Hilda quote-unquote loses or lost his message, which made me so upset that you would live with a sister who wouldn't support you dating somebody else, even though your previous boyfriend was someone like Walter. Y'all, I would never forget Hilda for doing that. In season 4 as well, when they meet Bobby Talercio, Betty manages to hang out with Bobby. Hilda immediately tells her that she is not the type for Bobby, and I guess that sort of prototype doesn't hang out with girls like Betty. In fact, many times during the show, she lets Betty know that she is not a type of person that can fit into a specific space. I know Hilda is seen as the protective, bold sister. Sometimes she can be Betty's biggest hater, and that leaves me feeling very mixed about Hilda. She's not my favorite person, to say the least. They do have a sisterly relationship and they do get closer at certain times, but the way that Hilda treats Betty at times really left a sour taste in my mouth. Not to mention, she's also jealous about the fact that her own son looks up to Betty and her choices. Hilda is naturally a little bit upset about the fact that her life trajectory went a different path than she expected. But it's not only just Hilda that's a problem. It's a lot of people in the show, like Amanda and Marc. Now, I know, they eventually become friends towards the end of season 4, but to be honest with you, except Christina, Betty deserved better friends. Amanda and Marc literally bullied Betty through the early seasons of the show, and they really didn't think she was good enough for anything. In fact, Marc had a literal page in which he would take photos of Betty every single day to humiliate her and her fashion choices. That's not a good quality. And I know towards the end of the show, they do become much more friendly, but Marc's not a good friend. Sorry, not sorry. Even though Betty was deemed not as quote unquote good enough for a lot of spaces, she has a lot of staying power, resilience, perseverance, and she's also had quite a bit of luck on her side. And quite a few people were jealous of this. They were jealous about the fact that her and Daniel were able to have a close relationship, and that gave her privileges. They were jealous about the fact that she just wouldn't quit. They were jealous about the fact of a lot of things. It's also really disturbing how Marc did try and sabotage Betty in her career during different times during the show. And I know, yes, definitely he did start helping her out in some situations, and he didn't completely leave her out in the cold. But still, Betty deserved better friends than Amanda and Marc. Betty was kind enough to let Amanda stay in her apartment for a while, and yet Amanda still treated Betty like a maid sometimes, in which Betty had to literally discuss with her to stop doing that. Is it too much to ask from me that Betty should have had better friends that genuinely cared about her, loved her, and supported her? I mean, look at how Christina and her worked out. Christina was an avid supporter of Betty and used to give her great advice, and she is one of the reasons she really enjoys her time in London. That's who Betty should be friends with, but I digress. Speaking of talking about deeper topics, let's talk about the Betty effect. So actually, while I was doing research for the show, I came across this article that talked about the Betty effect. He says, this ugly Betty effect seems to be a uniquely second-generation experience in the UK. Many of our immigrant parents grew up in countries where people that looked like themselves were the majority. Yet going to an institution or living in an area where the normalcy and beauty are concepts that are conflated with whiteness is something that many of us have accepted, as we were exposed from a young age to a culture that our parents were not. Thus, reassurance from your parents becomes completely void. Instead, society has conditioned us to requiring validations from our white peers. This begs the crucial question: in an age where beauty companies and the media are trying to diversify their image and cast more ethnic models, can we decolonize our standards of beauty? But this effect rings true. There's also a deeper topic when it comes to the social dynamics and race in Ugly Betty. And maybe I'm reading too deep into it, but I do notice the cultural undertones between Betty and her peers. I'm not American, but I have heard a lot of discrimination towards a lot of people of Mexican descent in the US, deeming them as less than or made to work blue-collar jobs. I have a close friend who's Mexican, and we also discuss these social dynamics all the time, but you definitely do notice some hints of it in Ugly Betty. Hilda tells Justin, who ends up telling Betty, that people like them are not necessarily accepted into a lot of spaces unless you're J-Lo or someone who is famous Latinx descent, which is very disheartening. You also see this kind of similar dynamic again when Marc is asked to be Betty's assistant in season 4. Now remember, Betty is an editor and Marc is a mere assistant. Now, of course, knowing their history, you could argue that that's not really the same premise, but I did notice Marc's complete inability and shrewdness to making sure that he would never serve Betty coffee. I just thought to myself, if Betty was somebody else or of someone of different descent, would this be a problem? I'm not sure. And again, maybe I'm reading too deep into it, but there are definitely different times where you notice the social undertones. The fact that Betty lives in Queens, and Queens is not necessarily the most glamorous of areas, gets pointed out constantly during jokes throughout the show. Regardless, I'm glad that the show did not shy away from these dynamics and actually portrayed them, because it was a reality. For the time that the show was produced, the fact that they were even highlighting these problems in the first place was quite progressive for its time. But anyways, I just wanted to give Betty a shout out because she deserved better, for real. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Okay, bye!